No, Acts 10 is just part of it. But
Acts 10.
So it's unclean
Wonder what
sin,
that's
is that
about.
row, ritual,
no, this is a continuation of last week. It's on Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. That's what we're going to be discussing. Brother Matt, would you say a prayer for us to open us up?
Sure could. Being King, our Father, our King, we thank you for allowing us to share with you on this set-apart day, the Shabbat, as we come together to sing praises to you, to honor you, your word, the deeds that you've done, the miracles that you have performed before your people and before the world, to know that we who follow you are set apart, that we may honor your Shabbats from week to week, that we may come together as one mind, as one body, as one heart, and that we may learn your word to better teach it to our children and to those that we walk by on the way. I ask this in your name and authority, in the name and authority of your Son, Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. Toda, sir.
Acts 10.
That's just part of it. Don't get caught up there. But we're going to hit several different scriptures. Last week, did everybody catch the video last week or watch it? You did?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
Larry?
yeah.
You did?
Yeah. Shammai and Hillel.
Yeah. Brother Robert, did you?
I didn't even know we were ahead of you last week.
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
Okay.
I sent it out. I sent out the link in the text message for the group. Okay. Basically, we've just been discussing a little bit. We're going to start a short series of just discussing kind of the time of Yeshua. Where the temple was at, where the religious leaders of the day were at, emotionally and physically, and just the things that were going on, trying to set the stage for the Brit Hadashah overall, so that we can better understand the context when Paul's talking, like in Romans 14, or when Peter's talking in Acts chapter 10, the Gospels, Yeshua all through the book of Matthew. He was hitting on the traditions of the religious leaders of the time, some of which were good, some of which were not so good. It was the fences that the rabbis had put up, and then they built fences to cover fences, and fences to cover fences to cover fences. So there was just layer upon layer. And a lot of that is what Yeshua was coming against the religious leaders, not so much for the core values of what they were doing, but it was the fences and the fences and the fences. Just the burdens were so heavy, and we know he reprimanded them for that in the Gospels. So a couple things just to talk about some of the writings from the time. The Mishnah. Is anybody familiar with the Mishnah and where it comes from and what it is and what it represents? Any thoughts?
What is the Mishnah?
The Mishnah, we've got the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tosefta, we've got all these other writings, which was a lot of the oral traditions, right, that were passed down. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, they would never record these because they believed that it was not supposed to be recorded, that it was passed through the halakha from one group of people to the next group of people, and so on and so forth, from one generation to another. But when the Mishnah was recorded, it was study by repetition, study by review, or the oral Torah of halakha. And it was recorded, it spanned over about a 200-year period. And it's the same period that we're talking about with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Everybody caught that last week. Did that make sense on Shammai and Hillel? Who they are, where they come from, what the background was? Are you familiar with that, Stephen? Hillel and Shammai.
Hillel and Shammai.
The house of Shammai and the house of Hillel.
Maybe give me a little refresher.
Hillel and Shammai. They're teachers.
Yeah, there was about, I want to say it was about 200 years before Yeshua. They had a tradition, a halakha that they were doing, and there would always be two religious leaders establishing oral traditions in halakha at the time. And there was many generations, but two of those, just before the time of Yeshua and during the time of Yeshua, was the house of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel was definitely a little more lenient than Shammai for sure. Shammai was more considered a zealot. Yes, sir.
What's this halakha that you're using the word? What is your definition for that?
Halakha is the traditions, the oral traditions that were passed down from one generation to another. So when you have this commandment over here, how do you walk that out?
Okay.
And in the halakha, then there was fences established, and then the fences became more like Torah principle, and then they'd make a fence to cover that, and a fence to cover that, so it become more and more stringent. It's not so much that it was in error, but it was being taught as equal to and or Torah principle. And that's where Yeshua come into play. The Gospels, Mark, the book of Acts, Paul. Paul was a student of Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was a student of Hillel. Actually, he was a grandson.
And you're saying that Hillel
I believe
was
it's
more
spelled
liberal?
correct. Hillel was more liberal. Yeah, Hillel was, and we're going to see, what's that?
No, I just didn't look at it that way, but okay.
Hillel was actually the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. He was the prince of the Sanhedrin. He ran the Sanhedrin for a long time. Shammai was his, not his equal, but kind of his partner in that, and they had a lot of differences. They had about 350 something different major differences and kind of serious battles in some cases. I talked last week about Hillel and Shammai. Shammai at one point, Hillel being the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, so he was establishing and setting this halakha, and he was, the end all of all, so to speak, in the Sanhedrin. Shammai, by force, by sword, killed many of Hillel's students and forced Hillel to basically sit subservient to Shammai while Shammai established these 18 edicts, or 18, what's a good word for it? I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. 18 measures is what they're referred to as. Are you familiar with 18 measures of Shammai? No. So, in this, the Mishnah and the Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud, and then we have the Jerusalem Talmud, both of those were wrote and recorded. The section of the Talmud comprising rabbinical analysis of commentary on the Mishnah. So these Talmuds were wrote to basically explain what the Mishnah was saying, and the Mishnah was reviewing the oral Torah and what the Torah said. So that's these writings. It's like the Supreme Court today. We have the Constitution, then we have amendments to the Constitution, then we have a judicial system that establishes or explains in various situations what the Constitution's trying to say. So that's basically what the Sanhedrin did. It was the religious court of the day, and they would basically make rulings based on what the Torah says. The Mishnah then was recorded documentation of those rulings. Then the Talmud was basically explaining them, how do you live those out in your life?
So it's like
on a very basic principle.
So it's like third tier interpretation.
You could say that, yeah. You could say that. But it's the same thing. I mean, if we read the Constitution today and then we try to take that principle and put it into our walk as Americans, you know what I'm saying? That's sometimes tough to do because we don't understand the whole context behind what it's saying. Well, that's exactly the way it was with a lot of the Torah principle, because we talk about what? Kukim and Mishpatim.
Tish.
You see what I'm saying? Mishpatim you can understand because it's more on a literal basis. Kukim is, very tough to understand and not easy to rationalize in our minds, but it's the way it is, and that's what we got to do. So that's what a lot of the Mishnah was recording. Different books in the Mishnah were hitting on specific Torah principles. Other parts of the Mishnah, because there's several volumes to it, were recording what the second temple looked like. This is where Rico and Joseph Good and them have pulled a lot of this information from the Mishnah, saying, it was 7 steps or 13 steps or whatever the case may be, and it was this distance, and by the cubit, and this is what the length of the cubit was, and so this is how they've established this temple teaching, and also the model of the temple, because many models have been tried to be established and have been in error because you could never seat that many people, that were part of the temple services. You could never house the people in most of these models. So they've had a lot of learning and relearning to do to try to understand the temple and its scale and just the size of it overall. So that's what a lot of what Joseph and Rico are doing.
So they believe that can be trusted when, I mean, it's and I'm not trying to discount or anything, but it seems like so many times extra writings or whatever are either they're a little bit too on everything. They're either too sensitive, too spiritual, too irreverent, too everything's a little bit too, rather than just being right on the money. They seem to embellish with the commentaries to try to sensationalize or spiritualize or.
I would agree to some degree, yes. There's probably some instances, but you go ahead.
Just for kicks and giggles.
Sure.
All right. So in some aspects, maybe this is like, what's the difference between slow, as you come to an intersection, and yield, and the yellow light blinking? It says that supposedly means proceed with caution. And so when somebody comes to one of these things in the past, well, last time you told this guy this. And so, but that isn't what's really going on now. And so that's what what you're going through, that's what these things are explaining, is how to take each one of the items and rephrase it for the action that's occurring at this particular time.
Which is what the Supreme Court does today.
Yeah, they take it and try to, and a lot of times, and instead of using the Supreme Court, a lot of times that's handed back down to the lower court to review it. And you guys are smart enough to figure this out. Quit sending us this kind of stuff when you can do it yourselves. If it's a real problem, then let us know and we'll come and fix it for you.
Right.
But on the main line is that those questions that come up. Well, last week, you told Terry to slow down at that corner. Well, this week, there wasn't anybody there, so why do I need to slow down? Well, you know what? You should yield at that corner. Well, how is that different from slowing down? And then later on, a month later, they put in the yellow blinking light. Okay, so what does that mean? So that's kind of what your
Yes, because you'd have the Beit Din, right? The local, board of 3, so to speak, that would judge a situation. Then you had the lesser Sanhedrin, which would be.
If I clarified that or made it even worse.
Yeah, no. I think that helps. You had the lower Sanhedrin. Then you had the Sanhedrin Gadol, the large Sanhedrin. And actually, during the Second Temple, we know as you walk through the Nicanor gate from the court of the Gentiles, the court of the Sanhedrin was on the left of the altar. They were just right outside. I mean, if you walked out the doors into the Azarah, then right there was, basically, I can show you, let me see, right here. This is where the greater Sanhedrin met. This was their chambers and their council, was this area and through here. So, they were meeting at the temple. This wasn't like it was just a bunch of guys, out trying to establish their own principles, their own doctrine, their own methods. I mean, this was observed by all of Israel. I mean, this was, what I'm saying? This wasn't just a group of guys that decided that they wanted to establish some fences and put up some principles and find some cases and everything else. This was the court of the land. I mean, it would be like just laughing at the Supreme Court here. You know what I mean? I mean, they have the final say. They have the final verdict.
And just like our court system, they have to progress through different levels to get to that point.
Yes. But does it mean that every situation is perfect? No. No, it doesn't. They're human, just like we are. But does it mean that most situations are imperfect? No. I think a large part of it, and I think, take Nicodemus. Nicodemus, who went to Yeshua, he was part of this Sanhedrin. He's no dummy. Joseph of Arimathea, part of the Sanhedrin. And the two that buried, put Yeshua in the tomb, took him off the cross. They were both part of the Sanhedrin.
Were they high priests?
They weren't high priests, but they were part of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
They were.
Well,
they
I
were,
heard that the only one that can take the sacrificial lamb off of the altar were the high priests. Is that? I mean, in symbol.
They didn't in Egypt. We'll just put it that way. Did they in Egypt?
Well, he's got a really good point there in what he's saying. And so what I would like to throw in there is we have a little bit of a vacuum because who took over John the Baptist's place?
Right.
We don't really know. Okay? But whoever it was, because who was John the Baptist? He was the actual high priest of Israel. That's who he was. The high priest that's wrote about and listed is actually a Roman appointee. The one that's in there. He's a Roman appointee
Well, John's
and
father
not the
was
true
a high priest. Zechariah.
And see, that's a lot of the confusion. When we're looking at the Brit, none of this stuff is talked about. None of this stuff is understood. The mainstream doesn't. They don't even research it. How many pastors out there have read the Talmud, or even just
when Paul writes stuff, he's assuming that the people already know all this.
Yeah,
stuff.
Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He knew this stuff by heart. He knew the oral traditions. He knew all these things. And so when he starts talking, he expects that, you're going to know that. That's why Peter, like I shared last week, in 2 Peter at the end, it says Paul's writings are hard to understand. They're very complicated. And unlearned and untaught people will take them and twist them to their own destruction. Most of the mainstream does not understand anything to do with Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai or the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tosefta. None of these writings, where they come from and why. And it's not that you have to take them all as perfect, and compare it to Scripture. That's not what I'm saying. But still, it's crazy for you to be in a position trying to teach on a culture and a way of life and a time and a place and a context, not having that background. Because that's their history.
Well, was it Talmud or what's it? Shofefta?
So, Tosefta. It's basically like another Talmud in a sense.
Okay, was it Talmud or Tosefta or Mishnah or whatever that they were following, that Yeshua found them in such a strange state, spiritual state and state of mind?
Which...
The result of the spiritual condition of Israel when Yeshua got there, is that the result of trying to follow this Talmud?
That was the result of
nonsense?
of fences from oral tradition. This is what he's coming against. It's not the Torah principle. It's not even the fences, because as we shared on Tuesday nights and several occurrences, and we're going to go through more in this study. Most of the book of Matthew, Yeshua is addressing the Pharisees and Sadducees. Next week, probably the title is going to be "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," because that's exactly what he was addressing. We need to understand those, because the mainstream takes that and throws out all of Torah.
Yeah, because see, and the Messiah's deal was, you guys are so worried about crossing the T's and dotting the I's, you forgot what the sentence was about.
You worry about tithing mint and dill and cumin, right? And you forget the weightier matters of the law. That's what Yeshua is saying. You worry about all these fences that you put up to protect this commandment, which is good, but then you start teaching these like they're commandments, and then you have to put up another, and pretty quick you're so focused way out here 10 fences out that you forgot about the principle. You forgot about what the Torah says about it.
It's basically a psychotic dynamic.
Yeah.
Because you're getting yourself so pinched in that you'll be absolutely in bondage to bondage itself.
Yep. You're so focused on life, you forgot how to live.
And so that's basically what we're doing here is we're kind of going back through and understanding what was going on, you know, how did these measures get put in place? Who is putting them in place? Why? You know, and what does Yeshua have to say about them? What does Paul have to say about them? What's the book of Acts talking about? Because this is the confusion. That's why we have up here Acts 10. You know, we know that has to do with clean and unclean, so to speak, or common and clean. And there's a difference there. Mark 7, you know, again, is talking about the same thing. It's pushed as being a Levitically clean diet, but that's not what is being talked about there. And we're going to break down the Greek words, you know, koinos, koinou, and ekathardos, so that we understand exactly, excuse me, so that we understand exactly, because like in Acts 10, when Peter is shown the sheet, you know, he says, "No, Lord, I've never eaten anything common or unclean." Well, there's two different Greek words there. But then when the Spirit speaks back to Peter right away and he says, "Do not call common what I've made clean," that's the same Greek word. He didn't repeat the word on a clean diet. The Spirit did not repeat that back to Peter. But what he was talking about was a ritually unclean state. And Yeshua, you know, in Mark, that's the same exact principle. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had established these rulings, and it was about ritual cleanliness. There was degrees of being ritually unclean. You know, if you touch something, that touch something, that touch something, that touch something, that touch something, then you're ritually unclean. But if it touched you this way or that way, then, you know, see, then it was a whole different direction. I mean, it gets so crazy and so complicated.
Between yellow light and yield. And so on. Yeah.
I mean, it was crazy. And so that's what Yeshua is trying to say, you know, because they were talking about eating with unclean hands. That's what the context was in Mark 7. If you look at the same Greek word, koinos, you'll see it in Mark, and you'll see it in Acts, and that's exactly the same thing with Peter's vision. What Yeshua is talking about there, it's the same Greek word, and it's about being ritually.
Hey,
It's-
another question real
Yes.
quick.
I'm fine.
I
Get a
get
cup of
these, so I
coffee.
stop bothering you because you're trying to get something.
No,
across
you're
and
fine.
that's
No, I
great.
appreciate that.
Hillel.
And Shammai?
Yeah. Now, about what time frame are we talking? Because I wanted to ask you where are they at in relation to Hanukkah?
They the system of these
Not the system. Where are they at in time frame? Like 50
Hillel
years
died
later?
in 10 CE. Shammai, I believe, died in 50 CE, and he was born in 30.
Okay, so it would have been about 100, 200 years. Well, about 170 years.
Yeah.
beforehand.
But the dynamic of what these two are doing had been going on, though, for about 300 years, 250 years before that, roughly. I mean, right in there. So this was going on at the time of Hanukkah, yes.
Well, because see, that's where the Greek Hellenization was occurring to the culture, and of course Judah's like, no, we're old school here. We're not doing that. So that's, you know, you got to kind of have that background for like Hillel. And I mean, and again, you went with the liberal deal there, and that kind of throws me because, like you just said, he's a Nazi of Torah, basically. That this is the way it's supposed to be done, and he's really hammering on it, which is why Paul is the Pharisee of Pharisees, because he's got it all right down. So there's no liberalism.
No. Through Gamaliel and through Hillel, that's where Paul comes from.
Right.
So we could just say Hillel, Gamaliel, Paul.
Right. But so that's when you threw that liberal in there.
Shammai, see the Talmud actually, okay, so what happened between Hillel and Shammai is they started having differences, and the differences kept growing and getting bigger. Well, Shammai, are you familiar with what a zealot is? Simon Peter is referred to as the zealot,
Zealot.
right?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with what a zealot is?
Well,
I mean, it's zeal.
the root is zeal. So
Right.
obviously
It's being
it was-
very spiritually, religiously
yeah,
overzealous. Okay, the zealots during the first century basically became violent. And they were murdering people. They were a large part of the problem for the Second Temple being destroyed. The confrontations with Rome, they were involved in that whole
It
skirmish.
started with that ear in the garden.
And Peter
Well, that's
Peter
zeal.
was a zealot. He was very zealous. Now, zealot, I mean, the term changed through the context of history from the time just before Yeshua to the time of the destruction of the temple. You know, when it's used in Scripture, Mark and the other Gospels, they're not referring to Peter being that violent zealot that was involved in the destruction of the temple. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, we're
He
getting
was
at
before
another deal in there as well because Judah or
Hillel
not
was
Judah,
120
Judas
when he died.
was a,
Shammai was
and I don't know how you can put this in there, but the zealot, there's another kind of a zealot, I guess, which was the underground or the rebels that were causing the uprising, and Judas was one of those that was in that category, you might say, because his whole focus was the Messiah is here to liberate Israel, to restore us back,
To
and
be a
that isn't what
military
he was
leader
there
or
for.
something, it sounded like.
It was definitely an overzealous, militant, religious,
Yeah.
fanatical, I mean, like, crazy
But
thing.
Peter, on the other hand, is zealous in making sure that we're following the Torah, you might say. So it's a religious thing and a political
And
thing.
not above
There's two-
taking it to a physical,
yeah, it's
dynamic.
It's two different types of.
yeah, it is two different types of zealot. Same word, but in
Yeah.
Peter's time, you know, in Yeshua's time,
I need to
a
shut
zealot was not near as violent and aggressive, you know what I'm saying, as what it became. Hillel, when he died, he was around for 120 years, so he was 90 years, 90 BC when he was born. So, which, what the Maccabees was,
Yes.
what's that?
It was 167 BCE.
What, on the Maccabees, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
these
So
guys
actually, he
died
was only,
right after that. That happened. That's our back history, and that's what was going on. So that contributed
Yes.
to their way of thinking, their thought.
Oh, definitely.
these are the things that were going on and the problems, because Rome had occupied, the land from that time of the Maccabees right straight up through. It was just one group after the next, and there was lots of problems. Hillel was 120 years old when he died. Shammai was 80. So Hillel was, 70 years after the Maccabean revolts when he was born. So, I mean, it was right in that same time frame. So, so the house of Hillel, when I say was more liberal, let me give you an example. There's a lot of examples in the Talmud that you can read. But like there was a young man. This is kind of a famous story, but there was a young man, a Gentile, that came to Shammai and wanted to be, converted. He wanted to convert to Judaism, and he asked Shammai if he would take him and teach him the Torah. And Shammai, basically being a carpenter, he always had a ruler or a stick of measuring, and he basically just, get out of my face, no way. He was not interested, period, in teaching this Gentile, because he did not want Gentiles converting to Judaism. The same Gentile, what's that?
That thought still occurs.
Yes, it does. Yeah. The same Gentile went to Hillel, and actually the Gentile's comment is that, well, you teach me the Torah, I'll stand on one foot, right? And Shammai pushed him away. He goes to Hillel. Hillel was the Nasi, and Hillel said, basically what Yeshua says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Not his exact words, but same concept. And he said, if you do this, it's all of the law and the prophets and the Torah. I mean, it's everything. So Hillel was willing to bring in the Gentile. Shammai was doing nothing but pushing away the Gentiles. And this is the problem and the context that we see here. You look at Paul's writings. Paul is always talking about Jew, Gentile, Jew, Gentile, Jew, Gentile. It's the whole conflict of, whether a Gentile could come in, be converted, whether they were clean or unclean. You know, Acts chapter 15, what do we do with the Gentiles? You know, these new believers. You know, it was this whole concept and dynamic.
It's the Jonah syndrome.
What's that?
It's the Jonah syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Yep.
The Jonah syndrome.
Yes.
Because he didn't want Nineveh to repent.
Right.
Exactly. And the thing is, the city of Nineveh was given that opportunity due to something that occurred prior. It's written in our Torah why they were given the opportunity, who their founder was, who founded the city of Nineveh, their background. And so Jonah didn't want to go there because he already knew that if he went to Nineveh, that Nineveh would repent. He already knew that. He didn't want to go because he's jealous, because he's been struggling for years to get the Jews to repent, and they're not listening, they're not doing it. But he knows if he goes there, Nineveh's going to repent, lock, stock, and barrel, and make us look like a bunch of idiots because we're not listening. It's a jealousy thing going on, and it's still occurring to this day.
Yeah.
The Jews don't want the Gentiles coming in because they know that they will teshuvah, they will return, they'll go wholeheartedly on that, and they don't want that because it'll show them up. It's one of those things. Well, how come you don't ever listen to your dad? Your dad's got some really good ideas, but you guys never listen. You know what? I'm gonna go talk to your dad because I really. And the next thing you know, you got all these Gentiles that actually, if they convert, they're not really Gentiles, they're Jews.
Yeah, because
So,
Israel.
they do that, they become like natural citizens.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
So, and then they pass up the ones that are there. I mean, if you go to Israel today, I'm going to bet that probably 90% of the population is Jew only in name. They don't even follow their own. So that's why a lot of the Messianic groups that go over there that start the little communities.
The kibbutz.
Yes, thank you. That and Netanyahu, I think, has come up with a deal now where you can't do that anymore. You have to prove you're a Jew before you can come there. Before they were letting you come in, because who would want to come here when you know that everybody's going to be picking on us? Why would you want to come here? So if you want to come here, okay, fine. But now, what was it, last year or something, he passed some kind of a legislation or a law that you have to prove that your mom is Jewish or
You
your
got to show
Yeah.
documentation for.
And it's very, very expensive too. I mean, you got to be very wealthy or have some sort of supporter, and even to be able to afford to do that. Because Michelle's actually been contacting them and finding out what the requirements, just out of curiosity, just for understanding, what does it take to Aliyah? She contacted the Jerusalem Chamber of Commerce or something, and was acquiring information on that. So, but yeah, Robert's exactly correct. I mean, that's exactly what's going on, and it's still going on today. That's why even today, we know there's many groups out there that say there's the Noahide laws, and then there's the Torah, and only a Gentile can do the Noahide. They're not required. They can do the others, but it's not going to change their situation. They'll never really become Israel. There'll always be that separation. And that all stems from, a large part of it comes to this group right here, the House of Shammai. But the House of Shammai at one point got absolutely physical and violent. They set up most of their students in the university. This is like two universities, you might say. Two schools of thought when it comes to Torah and Torah principle. And Shammai set up a group downstairs with swords, and basically they murdered Hillel students to the point where there was a smaller group upstairs. Hillel ended up sitting subservient to Shammai, and Shammai established these 18 measures. These 18 measures all had to do with ritual purity. How you could serve in the temple, what you had to do, what does a teruma, an offering, look like, how does all this stuff come into play? And these were the issues that were going on. Let me read a couple more things for you. So we went over Mishnah. Rabbis in the Mishnah are teachers of the Torah, basically is what they are. The Gemara is a section of the Talmud comprising rabbinical analysis, and commentary on the Mishnah. So they were the explainers or interpreters of what the Mishnah was saying about the Torah. The Nasi is the prince or president of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin acted as a Supreme Court to decide cases. There were two main courts, the great, 71 members, and the lesser, 23 members. Because of Rome in 200 CE, the court dropped the name Sanhedrin and used the name Bet Midrash, which we have a lot of those writings of the whole series of the Bet Midrash, which is another writing. But that was in about 200 CE is when they dropped the name, and they did it because of Rome, because of the persecution that was going on around that time. And then the court was finally abandoned in 425. That was basically the last time there was any form of Sanhedrin of any kind. At that point, they were called a Beit Midrash, but it was still a Sanhedrin council. Teruma, though usually translated heave offering or wave offering, is not an offering per se, as it was not burnt upon the altar. Rather, it was the dedication of an item or person to the service of the temple. In the Talmud, it designates a free will contribution above and beyond the tithe, that the Torah calls on a man to offer to the temple service. The chulin, the offering that the teruma was not set aside, which made it ritually unfit. So they had deemed this through one of their rulings as a chulin because it was an unfit teruma, so to speak. It was ritually unfit, so it couldn't be used as a teruma in the temple service. Tahara means pure, that which could be used for kedusha. So there was tahara and tuma. And tuma would be ritually unfit for kedusha. Tahara would be ritually fit for kedusha. And these were the main topics, the main problems between Hillel and Shammai just before the time of Yeshua and around the time of Yeshua. Because Hillel ended up dying in 10 CE, and Shammai was in 50, so he was still around 40 years after Hillel was gone. Now, it's interesting, though, if you look in the Talmud, and I'm going to say, I might be off on my years, but it was probably 80 or 100 years after the death of Shammai, the Talmud, they actually ruled, Israel ruled in the Talmud that anybody that followed the orders or the edicts or the measures of Shammai would be put to death. So they actually outlawed Shammai's teachings in the Talmud. Israel proper itself said, no. This guy was out to lunch. You even go down that road, when it comes to Gentiles and ritually fit and all this, then we'll put you to death. You need to be put to death because he's absolutely incorrect. So they ruled in favor of Hillel. So that's what we see in the Talmudic writings and the principles and everything else. We will see Hillel's rulings.
He was born in Babylon, he died in
At what
Jerusalem.
point did Gamaliel come in?
Gamaliel was a grandson or a great-grandson, one or the other of Hillel. So he was...
Shammai already gone after,
Um,
you know?
He was a great grandson.
no, because Paul learned from Gamaliel and Shammai was still alive.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I don't think so. I think they were in the same time frame, because Paul would have been learning. It would have been real close at the end of Shammai's life. And I don't think Shammai had the pull. I don't know exactly when he kind of lost his. What are you smiling at, sir?
Nothing.
You just
he's
look.
old and he's kind of no longer has the, like you said,
The
the
pull or the push. So no. But definitely the principle was still there, and that's why he was fighting against, and that's why Paul was saying the things that he did in all of his epistles. That's why he was constantly the Jew, the Gentile, the circumcised, the uncircumcised, the this, the that. It was all about ritual purification that he was trying to beat up. Romans 14. Again, the mainstream will take that and say, see, It doesn't matter about the Sabbath. We can celebrate every day alike. It doesn't matter about whether we eat meat or only vegetables or whatever. We can eat anything we want. You know, they'll use that to right. But
It's
he was not.
exactly opposite of what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
he was talking about ritual purity of foods and what you could bring as the offering, the teruma, what you could bring before them. He basically, Shammai said, the Gentile can't. The Gentile had no way, but the Torah says the Gentile can.
Yeah.
So this was the conflict that was going on. So when we look at the Brit, and if you don't even have a basic background of where these problems occur, you'd never pick up on them. And it's no wonder, you know, the mainstream today has gone down this road of just kick the whole Torah out because they don't understand any of the context. The whole Western Wall just fell on you.
Yeah. Well, and you know, with what you're doing here, really, we need to go completely back to Bereshit in the beginning and realize that when God created man, he created everything, the angels and everything else. And so why are the angels so jealous about mankind? What did God do to mankind that he didn't do to any other creation?
Gave them authority.
Well, he
Gave
gave him
choice.
a divine essence of himself. So every person contains within their physical body a spark or a light of the divine essence, which is why Abraham and all subsequent generations are supposed to be, proselytizing. They're supposed to be going out. The Jewish people are supposed to be a light. They're supposed to be
Bringing
drawing
in
people,
the Gentiles.
They're supposed to
Yes.
be drawing them in because those are spiritual beings that have an opportunity to become more than what they are. To discover within themselves that they are actually united with the Creator. The angels were terribly upset, especially Satan, because he does not have that spark of divine in him. No matter what he does, no matter how hard he tries, he does not have that part of being God. He can't be a part of God. He's completely separate. Okay, but you and I, because we have that divine breath from God dwelling within us, we have an opportunity to become more than what we are. Satan can't. He's stuck where he's at. And so are all the numerous beings and I don't know what other words to use, because a lot of people, I don't think they really understand. If you read Revelations, there's some descriptions of beings that if you were to meet these things out here, you know, if you could actually see them, I'm sure you would probably go, ah! You know, freak out because of the descriptions they're made. So yeah, we all have that divine spark, and that is one of the things that Paul is trying to say to the, you know, we're supposed to be bringing these people in so that they can become part of this.
Every time Israel got in trouble, just about every time Israel got in trouble, a large part of it was because they were closing themselves off to the world. They were not going out and bringing in. They had their doors closed, and they wouldn't let anybody else in.
Because we're special.
Yes. Yeah.
We're so special. Yes, you are, but you're supposed to be bringing everybody else in.
Take that set apart a bit too far.
Yeah.
They do. Yep. Okay, any thoughts or questions on what we've discussed so far? Just briefly. Okay. I'm going to read a few things to you, and we'll just talk about them as we go. The 18 measures. This is part 2. It's touted as another upper room. The Mishnah Tractate Shabbat 1:4 and its corresponding passage in the Babylonian Talmud present a strange puzzle to those who study it deeply. Let us begin with the Mishnah passage that is discussed in the Gemara. And the Gemara is a book of the Mishnah. These are some of the laws which they stated in the upper room of Hananiah, Hezekiah, Begurian, when they went up to visit him. They took these people that he's going to be talking about are like the predecessors to Hillel and Shammai. Okay, so this is the generations just before that was basically working and operating in the Sanhedrin under the same principle as Hillel and Shammai. The exact nature of these 18 edicts is not given in this passage. Indeed, the very next passage of the Mishnah holds a lengthy comparison and contrast between the halakha of the schools of Hillel and Shammai, whereas Shabbat 1:4 indicates that these 18 measures were passed on universal halakha by vote. The very next line of the Gemara also indicates that the full corpus of the measures was lost to later sages, with other additional rabbis questioning whether the Mishnah passage above might refer to these passages that came before. The mystery only deepens when we read on in Shabbat 17. Shabbat 17 suddenly interjects a curious and sinister footnote into what would otherwise be a fairly standard discussion on ritual purity. They plunged a sword into the schoolhouse, saying, "Let anyone come in who wants, but no one is going to get out of here." And on that day, Hillel sat humble before Shammai like just another disciple. And that day was as hard for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made. This is quoted in the Talmud. This is specific writing. So this is later on, and they're referencing back to what happened on that day that Shammai basically took over the Sanhedrin, so to speak, by force and made these 18 measures. Was as bad then because of what these measures he put in place as it was they compared to the day that Israel made the golden calf at Sinai.
Wow.
That's how serious they deem this. And that's why I say in the Talmud later on, they basically, pretty much outlaw any of his writings and the things that he changed, because they said anybody that follows Shammai basically needs to die. They were absolutely and utterly against it. Why did they plunge a sword into the Beit Midrash? Both the Socino and Scottstein footnotes claim that this was merely the standard practice when taking a vote, but neither cites any other passage of the Talmud to indicate that it was so. And after an extensive search, it's not found anywhere else that a sword is mentioned in connection with the Beit Midrash or with passing a ruling. Furthermore, plunging the sword into the door is accompanied with what appears to be the thinly veiled threat, and is immediately followed by the humiliation of Hillel, another unique event in the Talmud. Finally, it concludes with a curious phrase, "And that day was as hard for Israel as the day in which the golden calf was made."
Did Dave call you? Okay, because he apparently called me, and I asked him what he wanted, and he said it was the wrong number, so I'm thinking he's wanting to talk to you about it. Because you're taking David home? Okay, maybe that's what he wanted.
Was there indeed a threat, or perhaps even actual violence? The Jerusalem Talmud, Shabbat 1:4, actually states that the followers of Shammai did murder the disciples of Hillel. Rabbi Yehoshua taught, the students of Beit Shammai stood below, killing the students of Beit Hillel. We learned 6 of them went up, and the rest stood upon them with swords and spears. This is an astounding twist to the strange event. How could it be that one great house of the Pharisees should actually murder the members of the other? A clue may be found in the site of the Beit Midrash, the home of Hananiah ben Hezekiah ben Gurion. The Jewish Encyclopedia states that Hezekiah ben Gurion is believed by some scholars to have been one and the same individual as Hezekiah the Zealot. When King Aristobulus, taken prisoner by the Romans, had been poisoned by the followers of Pompey, Hezekiah, Ezekias, and Josephus gathered together the remnants of that king's army in the mountains of Galilee and carried on a successful guerrilla warfare against the Romans and Syrians, while awaiting the opportunity for a general uprising against Rome. The pious men of the country looked upon him as the avenger of their honor and liberty. Antipater, the governor of the country, and his sons, however, who were Rome's agents in Palestine, viewed his patriotic band differently. In order to curry favor with the Romans, Herod, unauthorized by the king Hyrcanus, advanced against Hezekiah, took him prisoner, and beheaded him with the formality of the trial. And he also slew many of his followers. This deed excited the indignation of all the patriots. Hezekiah and his band were enrolled among the martyrs of the nations. So he's just going through here basically explaining the violence and the things and the terrible things that were going on as they were battling and struggling over control and what was going to go on. And this is all just prior to the time of Yeshua. And so when Yeshua comes on the scene, what's going on is a big stinking mess. And we know the second temple was corrupt. It was terrible. There was many things going wrong.
Adds a new level to when they were called a brood of vipers.
Yeah. It was a brood
I'm
of
listening to you
vipers.
tell the story of Shammai and Hillel, and how later the Romans came and did the same thing against the Judeans and the Jews as they did against Shammai.
It was just a horrendous time, and that's why I say, I mean, it's so important, from Matthew on, that we just really understand, what the mentality, what the life was like. That's never really described. Everything's always just pointed fingers at the Jews, and the Jews were bad people. That's what we hear about, so to speak, in the majority of the mainstream. But it wasn't just the Jews. It was certain sects of the Jews that were the problem. It was not the whole thing, the whole cassava. It was just parts of it. And that's what we need to understand, so when we go through Scripture, we can pick up on those things. Again, Rico and Joseph, this just falls right in play with that, because, they're hitting on temple language in the Brit Hadashah, right? Joseph said last week or the week before that if you don't understand temple language, you miss 90% of the Brit Hadashah. Because the problems at the time were about ritual purity when it come to the temple. So all these things surrounded the temple. That's what the problem was. That's what many of these problems were surrounding. So it falls right in play with what he's talking about. If indeed Hananiah was the son of Hezekiah the Zealot, the actions of that night begin to make sense. Beit Shammai is well known for criticizing the leniency of Beit Hillel, especially in regards to Gentile converts. Shammai himself was known for driving away potential converts who turned to Rabbi Hillel, who accepted them in gentleness, Shabbat 31a. So again, these are writings straight from the Talmud that we're talking about. Well, he cannot state that this was the case with certainty. An alliance between Beit Shammai and the Gentile-hating zealots in the house of Hananiah ben Hezekiah does not seem impossible. So you can start to see some of the battle lines, is what he's saying. The battle lines are being drawn, and you can see through historical evidence where these people were joining forces and wreaking havoc. Rabbi Hillel was not simply forced to sit at Shammai's feet because his side was outvoted, but was apparently forced to under threat of violence to himself and his students. It would not be the only time that Shammai and his students threatened Hillel either. In another incident recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, Betzah 20a, Hillel once went up to the temple to offer a burnt offering and was accosted by several students of Shammai. Rather than risk confrontation in the very temple courtyard, Hillel offered a lie that they accepted and moved off. The fact that Shammai's students were so emboldened as to accost the esteemed master, and that Hillel had to offer a lie on holy ground to go his way, is telling of the atmosphere that existed at that point. This was especially telling given that Rabbi Hillel was highly respected by the priests who turned to him on matters of halakha. And you can see that in the Babylonian Talmud Pesakim 66a. Surely Hillel should have expected aid from the priest. What had happened to so dishonor the once honored rabbi that he had to lower his eyes before mere students? The real question The real key question is this: what were the 18 measures? Why were they considered so important to Beit Shammai that they would actually resort to violence to get them passed? And how would their passing be considered as hard for Israel as the day that would have resulted in our destruction, if not for the intervention of Moshe? We will continue to explore this mystery. 18 Measures, Part 3, the measure and ritual purity. The discussion in the Gemara, book of the Talmud, is, as always, challenging and does not seem to provide a complete list of enactments. Nevertheless, it presents the following as representative of the whole, citing in Zavim 5:12. These render teruma, wave offering, unfit. He who eats food unclean to the first, remove, and he who eats food unclean in the second, remove, and he who drinks unclean liquid, he whose head and the greater part of whose body enters drawn water, and one who is clean on, whose head and the greater part of the body 3 logs of drawn water fall, and a scroll, and hands, and a person who has completed his rites of purification awaits sunset to be completely clean. And food and utensils which have been made unclean by unclean liquids. Shabbat 13b. The teruma, though usually translated heave offering or wave offering, is not an offering per se, as it was not burnt upon the altar. Rather, it was the dedication of an item or person to the service of the temple. In the Talmud, it designates a free will contribution above and beyond the tithe.
So can we consider Samuel a wave offering?
Actually, I think we're going to get into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, sir. Good point. Through the Torah, or though the Torah did not specify the amount that should be offered as teruma, Jewish law established the proper amount as being between 1/60th and 1/30th, depending on the piousness of the offer. The teruma was not given directly to the temple, but could be given to any priest or technically any Levite. And the Pharisees were quick to rule that it should be only given to priests allied with their body. Food that the teruma had not been set aside for was called chulin and could not be eaten. So he's starting to paint the picture a little bit here. You can start to see how things are lining up. It had to do with the offerings, had to do with the money, the food. It had to do with lots of different things, the control, kicking out the Gentiles, and then this teruma going straight to a specific part of the priesthood, or Levitical aspect of the priesthood. And the Pharisees were standing there basically ruling, saying it must come to us, our group, not that group. Because there was, again, 2 sides in a lot of the ruling bodies, and had been that way for about 400 years. 250 years prior to this and about 100 years after this is how long this was going on.
Huh.
Wow.
That's not familiar.
So is Messiah considered a Pharisee?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
We
amen.
believed in the resurrection, right? So
In fact, I've got this book that's really good.
Okay. I didn't realize you had that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a ton of
Well,
information in there.
he's referred to in the New Testament. I mean, if you read it, he's called a Pharisee in the New Testament, because only rabbis can be called, only a Pharisee can be called a rabbi. So I'm just
Right, because they were the teachers of the oral Torah. And that's what Yeshua is doing through many of his writings, was teaching the principles of oral Torah. I know that's not a popular thought today, but it's the truth. At this point, we should define some terms. The teruma is commonly translated as the wave offering or heave offering, not burnt upon the altar as sacrifice, but presented before the priest for service in the mikdash. The word came to mean the tithe, not only of one's grain and produce, but of all one's income, even down to one's spices. We pick that up in Matthew 23:23. Woe to you hypocritical Torah teachers! In Parashim you pay tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of Torah, justice, mercy, trust. These are the things that you should have attended to without neglecting the others. So again, Yeshua there is ruling on halakhic principle.
And he's saying again, as he's saying there, he's saying you're so focused on crossing the T's and dotting the I's, which is good, but you forgot what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So even though what you did is okay and it's good, you need to go back and do what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, we see he says, do as they say, for they sit in the seat of Moshe, but don't do as they do, for they say and don't do. And that's what he's talking about there. It's not what they're, exactly what they're teaching per se, and their position that's incorrect. I mean, a lot of it's correct, but it's what they're doing behind the scenes, and then the things that they're adding on and tacking on, the burdens. He talked about the burdens, and that's why he's referencing it to the weightier matters of the law. The weightier matters of the law. Wait a second. I thought the law was the law, and it was just all weightier matters. There's weightier matters?
Uh-oh.
If there's weightier, that means there's lighter matters. So you look at the terminology, and it really starts painting a whole different picture. The invalidation of the teruma was an important issue in Pharisaic Judaism, as we will see below. Degrees of uncleanness. At this point, we should define some terms. The teruma, I read that. The word translated unfit is pasul, which is not to be confused with unclean, tameh. It is most likely the term rendered as koinos, which we have koinos up here. Koinos and koinu are the same thing. It's just one is made common, the other one is common. Okay, that's the only difference between these two right here. When we come to akathardos, which is used in Mark, then it's a whole different concept. Akathardos, it's all through Matthew, Mark, Luke. I mean, it's all through there. Akathardos has to do with like unclean spirits and unclean things. Literally, physically unclean. Even foods that would fall in akathardos. Koinos is common. That's ritual purity. That's, if it's not presented and done just right, then it's ritually impure, even though it's a clean substance, but it's ritually impure, so it can't be used in the service of the temple. So that's what we're going to get down to. It is most likely the term rendered as koinos, profane, common, defiled, unholy. Verb form, koinu. In the renewed covenant scriptures, in Matthew 15:11 and Acts 10:15, what makes a person unclean is not what goes into his mouth, rather what comes out of his mouth. That is what makes him unclean. Something that is unfit or profane could not be used for holy purposes, but could be used for other purposes without risking the spread of tameh. And tameh is what? Unclean, like foods and other things. I mean, like sin will make you tameh. You'll be out of covenant. You won't, you will not be walking appropriately with Abba. That which could spread the condition of tameh by touch was called tuma. Tuma was considered to have multiple degrees of transmission, with a corpse uncleanness being the most severe, or first degree, or tameh. Contact with that which is tameh would render one tuma of one less degree. So, for example, a person who buried their father would be tuma in the first degree, or av hatuma. Someone who laid a hand on their shoulder would be tuma in the second degree. And that would be referred to as shani. If the person then shook hands with a third, that person would be considered shlishli unfit, pasul, to enter the mikdash.
Now, I know because I'd asked about this a long time ago. So, how does one become clean today? I mean, if you go in and touch a dead body, how do you become clean now?
I don't know right off the top of my
Yeah,
head,
see,
but we can
talked
get
about
that
these
answer
a
real
long
easy.
time ago, and
Yeah.
one of our other, I think when we were in the other room, we talked about these different deals, and that is what I'd really like to find answers to, which I was hoping that when we watched that video with the temple teaching, because he was going to get into some of those, I thought he never did.
Actually, he has been hitting on some of that. I think there's one that's a 7-day period, sunset, a mikvah, you know, all these things, yeah.
So, I mean, if somebody was to have been, you know, processing hog meat or whatever, how long are they unclean?
Right, but now they're, right, and then we have to decide in each situation, are we talking ritually unclean, or are we talking, you know, a physical uncleanliness, tameh? Food that was shlishli is unfit to the Pharisee to be consumed, but incapable of spreading the condition of tuma any further. Priests were capable of sustaining a 4th degree of tuma, called reve'i, but other Jews could not. Why the concern? It should be noted, of course, that it is direct command of the Holy One to make distinction between the holy and the profane, right? And between the unclean and the clean. Leviticus 10:10. You want to read it for us, brother? Or any one of my brothers?
Yeah, let's see. Leviticus 10:10, you said?
Yeah.
I'll take a look here. Alright.
So that's to make a distinction between the set apart and the profane, between the unclean and the clean. Oh wait, no, it's back one. It's here. Do not drink wine or straw drink, you nor your sons with you, when you do go into the tent of appointment, lest you die, a law forever throughout your generations, so as to make a distinction between the set apart and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean, and to teach the children of Israel all the laws which Yahweh has spoken to them by the hand of Moshe.
So there's two distinct, right? We're talking about ritually unclean, and then we're talking about like a physical unclean. I mean, you know, tameh. Tameh is what, you know, clean and tameh or tahor. You know, this one is like diet and some of the other things in the Torah that puts us, you know, on the outside of the camp with Abba. The other one is ritually unclean, so that we can't serve in the temple.
Right, so you can't be intoxicated.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
there's the ritual part of it, but if you want to go into the physical part of it too, if you're intoxicated, your coherence is altered, your ability to rationalize and perform are probably altered too, so there's multiple layers to that.
Right. So there's two differences there. So when we're talking about clean, it can be used two different ways. Ritually clean, or we're talking about, you know, clean as in, you know, sin and something obviously that we're not supposed to do that will pull us from being in covenant with Him to outside of the camp, where we then have to correct
Are
our
you recording
actions.
this by chance?
Yes.
Awesome. So if you decide to have this same conversation again in the future with a lot of other people here, one thing you might want to bring up is what the New Testament says, where somebody asks the Messiah, they say, well, now who can possibly be saved? And his answer to that, because right now it would appear to someone from the outside sitting in here that, oh my gosh, you got this rule and this rule and this rule and this rule. You know, how are we supposed to, you know, the way you guys are talking, we can't do this, can't do that. There's no way to get saved. You know, I've just for whatever reason, Teshuvah, you know, I had this feeling that I wasn't learning in the church. You know, I found this group and you guys are talking about this stuff, and so I come in here all excited, and then you start in on this, and they're like, well then, you know, what's the point?
Right.
So that part where the disciples asked the Messiah, they look at him and they go, because they're basically, he was having a discussion similar to this at that point, and they look at him and go, you know, how are we supposed to get saved? What is this? And so his answer there would be a good thing to bring out if you have a future discussion with people that haven't been walking this path for a long time.
Right, and we're going to go through all those. This, I mean, truthfully, is still more of just the introduction, just setting the stage for where we're going, so that then we can go through the Brit and we can pick these things out, you know, that we'll understand. Even when we're going through, you know, the prophets and writings, we can pick these things out. We can understand whether they're talking about, you know, temple impurity, you know.
It's just important for people that are just
Ritual.
coming into this walk to understand that even with all this, that the Messiah himself tells us, you know, that the way of salvation, so that they don't become overwhelmed with, my God, these guys got so many rules, you can't even walk in the door without, you know, breaking some kind of a rule.
Right, but there's difference in salvation too, and that's a whole different topic in itself as well, and a whole different dynamic.
Well, just so you don't lose somebody that's new to the steps.
No, I agree. Furthermore, it is clear that Tameh could indeed be transmitted by casual contact. Leviticus 7:19 and 11:32 talk about that.
Which is why you don't touch a female when you're introduced to her.
Well, see, and that's the other thing that Shammai did, and we'll hit on that, but Shammai made it so difficult for those trying to come in, and Nidah, the laws of Nidah, and what aspect of, you know, where you were from, and the rules changed, and it was very complex. But we'll get into that, because that was more of what was going on during this time.
I was watching this rabbi bring forth a message this week, and he says, "You guys all call yourself Torah observant. None of you guys are separating your wives when she's going through a menstrual cycle." And it was just one comment.
Did you want to read it? I see you pulling it up. Or...
Well, the Leviticus 7:19, right?
Yep.
And the flesh that touches that which is unclean is not eaten, it is burned with fire. And as for the clean flesh, all who are clean eat of it.
Yep. And 11:32 is anything on which one of them falls when dead will become unclean. Wooden utensil, article of clothing, leather, sacking, any utensils used for work, it must be put in water, and it will be unclean until evening. Then it will be clean. There's a comment about stacking mattresses 10 high, and if you sit on the top mattress, even clear to the bottom, it's unclean.
Well, and if you can feel the pee, then that means you're a princess.
That's what I was
So
Well, you know, and seriously, that's where a lot of those stories and stuff.
they did. That's where they originated. Yeah, just in different cultures and different areas around the world, and it got embellished and became this tale that, you know, just continued to be told, and that's what it was about. By developing distinct degrees of impurity and defining what could be spread uncleanness and what could not, the rabbis were fulfilling their proper role. However, in doing so, they actually increased the strictness of ritual purity well above the requirements of the Torah. The Gemara, part of the Talmud, admits that, or the Mishnah, admits that this was the case when it points out that while Solomon decreed that hands may be tuma, he only did so in regards to sacrificial offerings. It was not until Hillel and Shammai that hands were considered tameh for the teruma as well in Shabbat 15. In fact, the 18 measures raised the bar for ritual purity so high that at least some of them were criticized and repealed by the time of Rabbi Judah Hanasi penned the Mishnah in Pesayim 19b. How did they do so? Let us take a look. For example, the issue of unclean hands. The Gemara tells us that hands are assumed to be ritually unclean because they are constantly touching things. Therefore, the hands had to be ritually washed before handling teruma. In the case of the Pharisees, which is an example of what we do over here, which is a ritual cleansing. You know, not specifically required, but it's a good practice, and it's that ritual cleansing, and that's why we do the hand washing. Therefore, the hands had to be ritually washed before handling teruma. In the case of the Pharisees, who recognized the corruption of the temple and who were trying to import aspects of temple worship into their daily lives, the dinner table was considered a type of altar. Thus, the ritual purity of the hands was considered as important for them as it was for the priests, saving in the Midrash. Exodus 30:21 and Mark 7:3. Exodus 30:21 says they are to wash their hands and feet so that they won't die. This is the perpetual law for them through all their generations. Mark 7:3, what do we get into? For the Parashim, and indeed the Judeans, holding fast to the tradition of the elders, do not eat unless they have given their hands a ceremonial washing. And that's when we start getting, into the foods. But 7:3, that's exactly what we're talking about here. To the point where it was said, whoever eats bread without washing his hands is as if he had sexual relations with a whore. Sotah 4b in the Babylonian Talmud. In other words, rulings affecting the defilement of the teruma would affect the observant Pharisee's life on a daily basis. The 18 measures would have the effect of splintering the people even more than they already were, to the point where even Pharisees could not eat with other Pharisees. We're not going to get as far as I wanted to today.
Do you need a
That's
smoke?
okay.
Do I?
Yeah.
I'm fine. Am I still in?
No, just didn't wanted to prevent it. It was gonna happen.
I tried to give him one earlier.
Oh, okay.
I'm fine.
Okay.
Fences, offenses. Several of the measures involve adding more stringent rules to the rules of ritual purity, often only for the sake of discouraging unwanted behavior. For example, the rule that allowing the greater part of one's body to enter drawn water would make one tuma came about to the end of the practice in which people would use fetid cave water for a mikveh, immersion pool, and then wash themselves afterwards. The rule that touching a sacred scroll made one tuma came about because the people began placing the teruma beside the scroll to show that both were holy, thus wasting the food. Another example, the Torah declares that things which could survive being heated by fire could be purified by fire, Numbers 31:23. It also implies that breaking an object such as an earthen vessel cleanses it, Leviticus 6:28, 11:33. In order to avoid people cleansing objects by simply breaking and repairing them, the rabbis declared that repairing an object restored it to its previous tameh state of being. If the breaking and repairing consisted of melting the object down by fire, obviously into the base metals, and using those metals to create new objects, Shabbat 16b.
Did you go over that again?
Yeah, it's kind of, and it's not so much that we're focusing on the detail, you know what I mean? But what I'm trying to paint is the overall picture of how much controversy there was going around and how they had put fences and fences and fences. So that when we get into the Brit, then we're going to see that, oh, that's exactly what Yeshua's talking about. That's exactly what Paul is talking about.
So, if I'm getting it right, say somebody was a butcher or something, then he has a heart attack, he keels over. So, that item that he was using would be unclean.
Yep.
So, their view was if, like, the leather handle or whatever was, that would have to be burned away.
Right.
So, but then if the metal that was used as the tool was broken down back into the base metal, and then if it was reforged, then it's okay for that bit.
That's what they're saying. But it's
In
interesting.
reality, what could be done is it could be mikvah and it would be vacuumed.
Well, yeah, because wasn't that actually in the Torah part that if it was washed and then immersed in a vessel, then it would stay there until
There's a
evening, and then it
prescribed
was
method,
washed.
yeah.
So then the whole breaking and melting down, that was, of course, one of the added-on bits.
Right.
Put up a fence so that we don't mess something up inadvertently. That was the whole purpose of the fences, was so that we wouldn't inadvertently
And that's the sad part about a lot of it. It wasn't, I don't think, well, of course, that's from the outside looking in, of course, but it's one of those things that I don't think that they originally started it with malicious intent.
No,
It's
they
just one of those things that it just, like, like a tumor, it just kind of grows out of control.
In a sense, I mean,
Which I have to apologize because that was a pun that's been going in my brain because he kept saying tuma. All I could imagine was it's not a tuma.
It's not a tumor.
Well, it's one of those little deals like that I always throw out there because with kids, you know, you tell your kids that they need to clean their shoes before they come in the house. Well, as they get older, the older kids go, you know what? If you take your shoes off, then you won't have to worry about it.
mm-hmm.
And then they get a little bit older, and it becomes take your shoes. You have to take your shoes off before you can walk in the house.
And
See,
pretty
that-
quick,
the
once you
original
take your
deal-
shoes off, you got to wash your feet, and then
Yeah.
you can go ahead and go through the.
Yeah,
You
see,
know,
it
just-
originally you just needed to make sure your shoes were clean. But you set all these fences up so that you don't, you know, you don't get anything in the house. So we'll set this other fence up, and then the next fence comes along, and then the next fence comes along.
Yeah,
Pretty
well,
soon you got all these. Oh gosh, when I go to Dad's house, I got to cross myself 7 times, stick my finger in my ear, and then I can put one foot on the step, and then I have to untie that shoe, and you know, and that's and the Messiah's like, guys,
You're missing
that's
the whole
not the point.
Yeah, taking this way too far. Creating fences around the Torah is, of course, an old and noble impulse. Pirkei Avot 1:1. A Christian who, not wishing to risk becoming drunk, eschews alcohol altogether, has built a fence around the commandment for himself. However, soon these fences either become sacrosanct and require fences of their own, or they lead to unintended consequences of practice that it becomes necessary to regulate. For his part, Yeshua kept many of the rabbinic fences himself and taught his own, as in Matthew 5 chapters 5 through 7. But he did not suffer that his disciples should be judged as sinners for having a different practice or wider fence in Matthew 12 and Matthew chapter 15. And we'll look at all these. We'll go through these in thoroughly. Here we see a similar confrontation occurring a generation earlier with Shammai, the driving force behind the creation of these fences. He who gleans grapes for the winepress, Shammai says, the grapes have been rendered susceptible to uncleanness. Hillel says, though the grapes have not been rendered susceptible to uncleanness, Hillel said to Shammai, how come grapes have to be vintaged in a state of tahara, ritual purity, but olives don't have to be gathered in a state of tahara? He said to him, so if you provoke me, I'll make a decree of uncleanness also in the matter of gathering olives too, Shabbat 17a. So again, it's just fences and fences, and if you put this fence up, I'm going to put this fence up, and
Well,
you know,
that was more of a. If you're going to tell me
the
put
one
this
is
fence
from.
up, you know what? I'll put a fence up over here as
Yeah.
well. If you're gonna keep digging at me for all these rules I'm coming up with, I'm just going to make even more rules.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, it's right. If grapes can be, then why not olives?
Yeah.
I mean, he's correct. Shammai, or Hillel's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
If it's good for one, it's good for all. Then, if that's the case,
All right, fine. I'll make some
and
more
I think
rules.
really what he was trying to say is, you're absolutely out of your mind, man. I mean, what are you doing? So,
You know, this reminds me of my mom gave us kids a big book of genealogy. You know, from where we came from. We hailed from, you know, southeast Carolinas and Virginia, and it's talking about the church services that they're going to. And they had a church meeting that actually came, and it was I don't remember exactly what it was. I'll have to look at it, but it was the funniest thing I'd ever, because they got absolutely in a brawl over like what color shirt to wear to church or something. And I was reading that and I was going, are you serious? I mean, and it made it to genealogical papers that it should be, it was recorded down to where these kids, or these two church, and I was going, haven't you got anything else to do?
yeah,
Is
That's
this
what
all
you're
you
all
have
about.
to
That's
waste
what
your
Paul
time?
says in Romans 14. Man, if you want to wear a blue shirt, wear a blue shirt. But this guy says he wants to wear a red shirt. Let him wear a red shirt. And you know what? I mean, let each one, figure that out for themselves. Stop bickering and fighting. Then the mainstream comes in and takes that and says, oh, see, all foods we can eat. That's not what Paul's talking about.
Everybody's gotta wear a
Paul's
red
saying
shirt.
if you want to wear a blue shirt, wear a blue shirt. But don't tell Joe he's got to wear one too.
Not if you're on Star Trek. You don't want to wear a
Right.
red shirt.
Well, basically, what it was telling me about this shirt, don't go to either one. They're
Pretty
both
much.
nuts. I mean, that's kind of what it was. It's like, is this all you have?
Right.
to
But see,
argue?
Paul's
Is this
talking
what
about
you're
that
gonna waste your time on?
ritually pure and offering food up to idols. That's what he's talking about. And that's why he says if a brother's walking by and sees you eating this food, it's going to, you see what I'm saying? And so he's saying, I'm not going to do anything to cause my brother to stumble. I'll never eat meat again. I don't care. If it's going to cause my brother to stumble, I love him first. That's more important than any meat or any idol or any food that's offered
Well,
up
and
to
if you
idols.
take that to its extreme, don't ever do anything ever again, because somebody somewhere sometime is going to stumble over every little breath.
That's where
you
these
take.
fences come in, and that's why
That
some
is
are good
absolutely
and some are
insane.
insane. I agree with
That
you.
is the definition of crazy.
Even here, we see that Shammai clearly sees himself as a charge over Hillel rather than Hillel's equal. The very next line of Gemara, they stuck a sword in Beit Midrash, amplifies for us again that the measures were passed in a night of violence under the threat of still more violence. It was the end result that this compromised Israel's true mission to be a light to the Gentiles, as we will see. So I think we'll stop there and just wrap up right at that point. For
Wait
this
a minute,
week.
we're just getting going.
Well, we can discuss this up here though, because
It's a real cliffhanger left on the stage.
it's going to be a bit. I mean, there's so much. There's so much there that we.
Come back so we can get the full story.
Well, you were talking about the person that was, against alcohol and set up his own fence,
Mhm.
and then those are the kind of people that eventually cause prohibition.
Yeah.
They.
Because
if
I
trade-
can't handle it,
Yeah.
you surely can't either.
can't
So
Yeah.
we need to put up and stop it all.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on here, and the other thing too is, a lot of people look at when somebody says they're Jewish. A lot of people have some kind of an image in their minds that all Jews are the same.
Yep.
That are not by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, Jews are kind of like the Christians. I mean, you got Pentecostals, Baptists, Methodists, and all that. Jews are the same way. Okay, you've got the different sects of Judaism. I
Oh yeah,
guess.
and there's a bunch.
Yeah. So
And even across the street, they can be totally different.
yeah,
I
they
mean,
all have a common core, just like
Yeah.
the churches do. That they all believe that the Messiah came. He's resurrection from the dead and those things. They all have that common core. But then they do like these two guys, plus 1,000 others besides that. Well, now in my deal, we got to do it this way. Well, in my deal, we got to do it that way. Well, you're wrong and I'm right. Well, I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah, and then they fight wars.
Yeah. Yeah.
And entire civilizations
Right.
die.
And that is where, in some aspects, from a Gentile point of view, the reasons we have these wars are because of the Jews. They're the ones that are causing these
Oh
wars.
yeah,
And so that's where
anti-Semitic values
Yeah,
start coming into
because
play.
they're the ones that started it.
I
And
agree.
in fact, and a lot of people, I don't know if they realize this or not, but in Nazi Germany, before Nazi Germany occurred, the Jewish population there was trying to, what's the word I want to use, acclimate itself to the population that was there. They were trying to stop being set apart, you might say. They were trying to
Totally
fit in.
assimilate.
Fit in, yeah.
They were trying to fit in, and because of that, World War I came around. World War II is like, you know what? We're getting rid of all of you guys. So it was the ones that were, what do I want to say, like reformed Jews that were doing that. The ones that were, we're Jews, that's it. That wasn't where the problem occurred. It came from the ones that were trying to acclimate themselves into a Gentile world. So that's where a lot of that anti-Semitic stuff came. A lot of people don't see that in history or get that part of the story out of history, but that's where a lot of that comes from.
Sounds good. Well, it's almost 3 o'clock, so I think we better just cease and desist on this. We'll go over this more next week, but
And next week I won't be here, so you'll get a lot farther.
so why don't we close out in prayer and then we'll take a break and go from there. Sound good? Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, Father, we just come before you and we're just thankful. We're so thankful, Abba, for your word, for your written word that we can read and understand and relate to and grow from, and that you can use that just to drive it deeper and deeper into our hearts and minds, Father, that we may walk it out and be right before you, Father. And as we read and study on these situations such as Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, Father, I pray that you just open up our minds to what you would have us take from it, Father, that we would understand that a lot of the controversies in Scripture and a lot of the controversies in the Brit especially, Father, are just basic arguments over things such as this, fences upon fences. Fences are good, but fences upon fences leave very heavy burdens, Father. And we pray that you just help us to weed through this, to open this up so that we can understand, so that when we go through the Brit, we can understand these topics and these problems, and we can hopefully help witness to others, and just to be able to defend what we believe in, what you've laid on us, what you've given us, Father, what you've put in our hearts and in our minds, Father. We just pray for your Spirit to be with us and just guide us in all these things, Father. We praise you, we love you, and we thank you in the authority of your Son, Yeshua HaMashiach, we pray. Amen.